In a world where time was both currency and curse, the marketplace buzzed with the hum of clocks. Time was traded here, sold in little glass vials like perfume, its passage marked by golden pendulums and the constant ticking of unseen hours. It was a world where seconds were precious, where minutes could be borrowed, and days could be sold for a fraction of a lifetime. People came from far and wide to bargain for their futures, desperate to hold on to what they could never grasp, time itself. Behind a stall filled with ancient hourglasses and silver chronometers stood the time merchant, a figure draped in flowing robes of deep blue. His eyes glimmered with the wisdom of centuries, the lines of his face etched in the shape of the universe itself, calm and knowing. Time was his domain, and in this bazaar, he was both revered and feared. He had seen it all, people buying more years for a second chance, trading their youth for riches, swapping memories for a glimpse of immortality. Time, he knew, was the most precious thing of all. On this particular morning, when the sun hung low in the sky and the market was particularly busy, a strange figure approached the time merchant's stall. The man was ancient, his body bent with the weight of 1,000 years. His skin was the color of cracked earth, his eyes a deep well of sadness and curiosity. His name was known in whispers throughout the world. He was the 1,000-year-old man, the one who had seen the rise and fall of empires, the one who had lived through the ebb and flow of history, and the one who now sought something he could never have, the lost time of his life. The time merchant glanced up, his gaze immediately falling on the old man. He had heard the rumors, the stories of the one who had lived too long, whose soul had been stretched thin across centuries. But what could such a man want with time? Time was his currency, but how could he sell something to a man who had already lived more than a millennium? The 1,000-year-old man shuffled closer, his steps slow, deliberate. He stopped before the stall and met the time merchant's eyes. "I seek your help," he said, his voice rough like the sound of gravel beneath a heavy boot. "I want to compress my life, to experience all the time I've lost in one final moment. I want to feel it all the seconds I never had. I want to live them all at once." The time merchant blinked, taken aback. The idea was ludicrous. Time was a fluid force, a constant progression, not something that could be compressed into a single second. No one had ever asked for such a thing. And yet, the old man stood before him, his gaze steady, his wish genuine. "You want to live a lifetime in a second?" the time merchant asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Not just live it," the old man said, his voice heavy with centuries of regret. "I want to experience it. Every laugh, every tear, every failure, and every triumph. All of it, crammed into one final moment. The last second of my life." The time merchant studied him, the gears of his mind turning. Time was a commodity, a force that could be manipulated in ways few understood. The time merchant had the power to bend it, to twist it, but such a request was unnatural. And yet, something about the old man's plea stirred something deep within him. What was the point of time if it couldn't be lived to its fullest? And if anyone deserved to feel the fullness of their life, it was this man who had lived through so much, who had seen history unfold like a flower blooming and wilting before his eyes. The time merchant hesitated. "I can give you what you ask," he said finally, "but I must warn you, time cannot be compressed without consequences. A single second is a vast thing, filled with endless possibilities. If you wish to experience all that you have lost, it will come at a cost. Are you sure you want this?" The old man nodded, his face unreadable. "I have nothing left to lose. I have seen it all. Let me feel everything I never had." The time merchant sighed and reached for a silver pendant that hung around his neck. It was shaped like an hourglass, its hand suspended mid-fall. With a twist, the pendant glowed with an ethereal light, and a clock appeared between them, floating in the air. It was a rare and ancient device, one that could manipulate the very fabric of time. The time merchant touched the clock's hands, and the air around them seemed to hum with the tension of the universe itself. The old man stepped forward, his hands trembling as he reached for the glowing timepiece. He could feel it, a strange, electric pull, as if his entire being was being drawn into the machinery of time itself. For the first time in centuries, he felt alive with possibility. Then, with a final flick of the time merchant's fingers, the clock began to spin. The world around them blurred, time folding in on itself, each second stretching, elongating, warping in ways the old man could never have imagined. The moment was no longer a single unit. It was infinite, vast, endless. The old man gasped as he felt his very being unravel, his consciousness splintering into 1,000 pieces. Each piece experienced a different life, a different version of himself. He saw himself as a young man, full of hope and ambition, standing in the middle of a city that was still in its infancy, the air crackling with the promise of tomorrow. He saw himself as an old man, sitting alone in a dark room, his memories faded like old photographs, each one slipping through his fingers. He saw the rise and fall of civilizations, the wars and the peace, the loves and the losses. He felt each moment as if it were his own, each laugh, each tear, each fleeting second stretching on and on, an eternity contained within a blink of an eye. And then, the strangest thing happened. The last second, his final moment, stretched out before him, not as a fleeting instant, but as an endless expanse. The moment he had asked for, the moment that should have been his final breath, became infinite. Time ceased to have meaning, and he was no longer sure whether he was living in the past, the present, or the future. And the time merchant? He stood by, watching, powerless to intervene. He had given the old man what he wanted, but he had not anticipated the consequences. Time, it seemed, had its own rules, and so, they stood together, trapped in a moment that never ended, both caught in the endless ripple of time. The 1,000-year-old man experienced all that he had lost, but in doing so, he realized that the moment he had sought was not a gift, it was a prison. He had begged to experience every moment of his life in a single second, but now that second had become an eternity. He turned to the time merchant, his face pale, his eyes wide with realization. "What have you done to me?" he whispered. "This is not what I asked for." The time merchant looked at him, his expression unreadable. "I gave you what you wanted," he said quietly. "But time is not something that can be bargained for. It is not something that can be lived in a single moment. You cannot compress the infinite into the finite." And with that, the two of them were caught in the void, the endless ripple of time stretching out around them, each second infinite, each moment both past and future, until the very concept of time itself no longer had meaning. The endless ripple of time stretched before them, a vast, empty expanse. The 1,000-year-old man stood at the center of it, his body trembling as he felt his own existence splintering into infinite threads. Each fragment of him was stretched out across time, each one living a different version of his life, some filled with joy, others with sorrow. Some were lives of success and achievement, others of failure and regret. Each moment, each experience, piled onto the next until the weight of them became unbearable. He had thought that compressing all of his lost moments into a single second would bring clarity, bring closure to his endless search for meaning. But instead, the second had unraveled him. He felt his consciousness stretching further and further, caught in an eternal loop of possibilities, each one more vivid than the last. At first, there had been a rush, an intoxicating flood of memories and experiences, 1,000 lifetimes flickering before his eyes. He had seen himself young, full of hope and ambition, standing on the edge of the world, ready to conquer it. He had seen himself at the end, an old man, weak and frail, looking back on a life filled with moments he could never fully embrace. But now, the flood had become a torrent. He no longer knew what was real and what was just another possibility. The present, the past, the future, all of it swirled together into a whirlpool of confusion. Time, which had always been so definite, so linear, had become a tangle of threads that no longer made sense. He reached out, but each thread slipped through his fingers, like sand scattering in the wind. He looked at the time merchant, standing beside him, still as unmoving as a clock's hands stuck in place. The time merchant's face was unreadable, his eyes narrowed as he watched the chaos unfold, but there was something else there, too. Something like, regret, the thousand-year-old man's voice broke through the silence. What have you done to me? He whispered. This isn't what I wanted. This isn't what I asked for. The time merchant didn't respond at first. He simply watched, his gaze distant, as if he were lost in the very same endless stretch of time that now consumed the old man. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, yet laced with an unspoken sadness. You asked for something impossible. You wanted to live every second, every moment, every loss. But time cannot be experienced in a single breath. It is a river, not a still pond. And you tried to drink it all at once. The thousand-year-old man closed his eyes. He could still feel the fragments of his life scattered across this infinite expanse. He could still hear the echoes of those moments, the laughter of children he'd never had, the soft touch of a hand he'd never held, the taste of kisses that had never been. It was as if the very essence of his soul had been splintered, and now, all he could do was watch those pieces scatter through time. Why did you let me do this? He asked, the anger rising in his voice. Why didn't you stop me? You knew it wasn't possible. You knew what would happen. The time merchant's lips parted, but no words came out at first. He looked at the old man, his eyes softening. For a moment, the world seemed to pause, just for a breath. Then, the time merchant spoke quietly, as though revealing a truth he had long buried. I have been selling time for centuries, he said. I have watched people come and go, each one desperate for more time, each one thinking that if they could just hold on to a little more, their lives would be complete. But time is a trickster. The more you try to possess it, the more it slips away. You asked for the impossible. But you were not the first. The thousand-year-old man's heart pounded in his chest. The words sank into him like stones sinking into the deepest part of a lake. You mean, you've seen this before? The time merchant nodded slowly. Yes. Over and over. There are those who seek eternity, but when they find it, they realize the curse of endlessness. Time is not something to be owned. It is something to be lived, to be experienced in its fleeting moments. You cannot hold it in your hand, for the moment you do, it slips through your fingers. The old man shook his head, the reality of it settling into him. He had spent centuries chasing after more time, more life, more meaning. But in the end, he had only unraveled himself. And now, this endless stretch, this infinite second, was all that remained. The universe, with all its possibilities, had become a prison. I thought I could fix it, he said, the words thick with regret. I thought if I could just feel it all, I'd understand. I'd understand what I missed, what I never had. You cannot understand time by trapping yourself in it, the time merchant said. You must live it. You must let it go. The thousand-year-old man closed his eyes again, the weight of his mistakes pressing against him like an invisible force. He had thought that by holding on to everything, he could find peace. But now he understood. The more you try to grasp time, the more it eludes you. Time was not to be captured or contained. It was to be let go. For the first time in his long existence, he felt something akin to peace wash over him, an understanding so simple that it took his breath away. He didn't need to experience every moment, to live them all at once. He needed to accept that the moments that had slipped away were gone, and that was part of the beauty of life. Is it too late? He asked quietly. Can I still let go? The time merchant stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on the old man's shoulder. It is never too late, he said, his voice soft but resolute. Time will always be there for you. But only if you stop chasing it. The thousand-year-old man nodded slowly, his heart swelling with the weight of all he had learned. The fragments of his life, scattered across time, were still there. But now, he understood, they didn't define him. His time had passed, but there was still something left, the echo of the moments that had been, the beauty of those fleeting seconds, now tucked safely in the past. As the time merchant spoke the final words that would release them from the endless loop, the old man felt the pull of time lessening. The threads of his existence began to slowly unravel, the endless possibilities fading into nothingness. He felt himself slipping from this infinite moment, back into the flow of time, back into the world he had once known. He didn't need to experience it all. He just needed to live, and with that, the world around them began to shift. The bazaar returned, the ticking of clocks filling the air, but this time, the old man no longer felt the weight of eternity bearing down on him. He was free, not because he had lived 1,000 lifetimes, but because he had finally let time go. The time merchant watched as the old man faded into the world, his long journey coming to an end. But something had changed. The merchant, too, understood now. He had lived for so long, trapped in his endless trade, never truly experiencing life. And now, with the old man's departure, he knew what he must do. He closed his stall, the clocks ticking softly behind him. Time was no longer something to be sold. It was something to be lived, and in that silence, for the first time in ages, the time merchant allowed himself to simply be.